and I know it's like 2 o'clock and you've had lunch and you haven't had coffee. So you're like at the lull of the day, and so I know how that goes. 2 o'clock's always a rough one. I'm Lindsay Jenkins. I'm a professor in the school psychology program over in the Department of Psychology here at Eastern. And so I mostly teach graduate classes for the school psych students, but I also teach some undergraduate classes too. This is my 3rd year at Eastern, and I've been doing bullying research for a while, since my dissertation and ever since I got out of grad school. And so I really have enjoyed research in bullying, but there's so much research on victims and victims and bullies really is where the vast majority of research is, which makes sense. That's kind of where we got started. Bullies were, there's something wrong with this kid and he bullies others. There's something wrong with this kid and he gets bullied. It's where we kind of got started. But it's so much bigger than that. It's not all about 2 individual people. It's so much bigger. And so that's what a lot of my research is kind of looking at things from a bigger perspective and not just focusing on, here's a bully, here's a victim, we need to focus on them. It's looking at it from a much broader perspective. And so the title of my talk is Social and Emotional Characteristics of Victimized Defenders. And so that's a unique kind of population of kids that we haven't really studied that much. We have started looking at defenders, which are kids who stand up for other kids. But we have some stereotypes about defenders that don't match up with what we have stereotypes about victims. So it's nice to kind of recognize that not everybody fits into these little holes of victims or bullies or defenders. So that's the goal of my talk today, is talk about what are some characteristics of this unique group of victimized defenders. So bullying research has been around a long time, okay? So in the academic research world, the first articles were published in the early 1970s, and I think some people would say it was even earlier than that. So we're going on about 4 or 5 decades of bullying research, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of articles on bullying. If you do lip searches at the library for bullying research, it's just thousands of articles. Because of the thousands of articles, we know a lot. We know a ton about bullying. We know a ton about victims and things that are related to bullies, things that are related to victims. And so we typically know a lot about their social emotional characteristics. So victims tend to have higher levels of anxiety and depression, and bullies tend to have higher levels of aggression and sometimes also higher levels of depression as well. There's a lot of negative outcomes associated with bullying. We would not have this bully prevention conference today if we didn't know that bullying was related to a lot of negative things for a lot of people. And so there are a lot of negative outcomes for bullies and victims, but also other kids. School climate has been studied a lot too. Okay, so what are characteristics of a school that may lead to more or less bullying happening in that school? And so there's been a lot of research showing the negative impact of school climate, on kids and their experiences with bullying. They've studied teachers' perceptions of bullying. So some of the general research on that is finding that teachers don't think it's happening as much as it really is. So when you're looking at having kids tell us how often they are bullied, and when you have teachers say how often they see bullying, there's a big mismatch. Okay, so teachers are very much underestimating how much bullying goes on in schools because the kids are actually reporting much higher levels of that. Luckily, we have all this research leading us to help develop prevention and intervention programs, okay? So like Dr. Bean this morning, he has created a bullying prevention program that is based on all these thousands of articles over lots of decades that have tried to kind of build up our prevention efforts as well as intervention whenever it is already occurring. One of the biggest things that we know about bullying, but that's not talked about as much, is that bullying does not happen in a vacuum, okay? So a bullying episode between a bully and a victim, they're not the only 2 people around when that's happening. So there are other people involved, and there's lots of things that contribute to when schools are seeing bullying happening. So based on that idea, somebody created what's called the social ecological model of bullying. Okay, so two authors, Susan Swearer and Dorothy Espelage. Dorothy Espelage is actually a professor at U of I. They created this social ecological model of bullying, which talks about, so we have individuals and their own individual characteristics. And those individuals reside in a larger context of social relationships. Okay, so those are things like their parents, their teachers, their principals, their church organizations, whatever it might be. Those individuals reside in this larger social context and have social relationships. Those relationships with others are then also part of a community. Okay, so the community has a lot to do with how much bullying we're seeing and those sorts of things. Okay, and then communities also kind of reside with a culture. Okay, within the culture. Some cultures, like in the United States, we have different levels of bullying than what you see in Europe or what you see in Asia. You have all of these different, I feel like the paparazzi's here. So yeah. So these communities reside within a culture, and that also has an impact on how much bullying we're seeing going on. Okay, so like I said earlier, we really started first looking at victims and bullies, and then after a while they realized, oh, there's some kids who are actually both. There are kids who are called bully victims. So they bully others, but they also are victims. Okay, so they are victimized, but they also perpetrate bullying or aggression as well. Okay, so bully victim and bully victim are kind of those original roles that we started looking at in the 70s and the 80s. Over time, though, we've added more. Okay, so we have the bully and the victim still, and then the bully victims. But now we're starting to recognize the importance of bystanders. Okay, so a lot of research in bullying is starting to look at bystanders and the impact that they have on bullying. Now, bystanders can be helpful or they can be hurtful. Okay, so an assistant is a bystander that actually assists the bully. Okay, so they assist the bully. A defender, though, is somebody who defends the victim. So they are students who might confront. Okay, so they might confront a bully, say, you need to stop this isn't right. They just do something directly to stop what's going on. A defender can also comfort. Okay, so they can comfort victims where, after they are picked on, maybe they could go up to them and say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Do you want to come play with us? Or, hey, why don't you come over to my house this weekend? We're having, pizza at my house. They can do things to comfort them and try to include them afterwards. So they can confront, they can comfort, or they can report. Okay, so they can report that bullying is occurring to adults. Typically, you're talking like teachers, recess teachers, whatever, principals, that sort of thing. Okay, so defenders are the most beneficial for schools to have. So ideally, the more defenders we have, the fewer bullying episodes or the less bullying there is. Okay, so defenders are really important. Outsiders tend to be the kids who ignore. Okay, so they might see it happening, but they don't do anything about it. They pretend not to notice or they ignore. Also, outsiders may just have no clue that it's happening. So if they don't have a ton of friends or maybe they're not really socially engaged, the outsiders are kids who just may not even know that it's happening, or if they do notice it, they might be ignoring it or pretending not to notice it. Okay, so assistants, defenders, and outsiders are newer roles that we've been looking at within that social ecology of bullying. Okay, there is overlap in these roles. Okay, so it's so easy to have them be circles. This makes my life a lot easier in research. Okay, so we need to study bullies, we need to study victims, we need to study defenders or outsiders or assistants. That makes it much easier, but really these circles are all intertwined and overlap, and it's like a big Venn diagram that's a little bit scary because you have so much overlap in these roles. Okay, a paper that I recently published with a couple other authors we looked at correlations between these behaviors. Okay, so we gave kids a list of items. Some of the items had to do with bullying, some victimization, some defending, all the different roles, and we had them rate how often they do those sorts of things. And we found pretty high correlations and overlap in some of these roles. Okay, so there's a high correlation between assistants and bullies, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, so an assistant was somebody who assists or supports the bully. So a 0.6 correlation is really high. Okay, that's a pretty high correlation. And so there is a lot of overlap. So I'm guessing, this is, I don't know, research-based information on this, but my guess is that sometimes kids are bullies, but the next day they might actually be the assistant. But then the next day they might be the bully. There's probably a lot of back and forth between if they're going to assist today or they're going to bully today. There's probably a lot of other things that influence whether they're an assistant or a bully on any given day or episode. Like I said before, we had already identified this group called bully victims. And so those are kids that initiate bullying, but they also are sometimes the target or they're the victim. But then the correlation between victim and defender was even higher than the one between bully and victim. Okay, so victim and defender were correlated at 0.41, which is a pretty high correlation as well. Stereotypically, defenders tend to be popular, well-liked, have great social skills, and they're pretty confident, they have pretty good self-esteem. That when you look at the research and you look at what are defenders, those are the things that you see. Great social skills, they're popular, they're well-liked, and it kind of makes sense. If you're gonna put yourself out there and take a risk, like a social risk of, I'm going to go confront this person or I'm going to go report, that's kind of a socially risky thing. Because if you report, that's my fancy word of saying tattle. Okay, I call it report, but other kids call it tattle. Okay, so that's a social risk to be like targeted as, now I'm gonna be called a tattletale. Okay, same thing for comforting. That's a little less obvious, I think, but confronting, that's a pretty obvious thing. Like if you are trying to stop bullying from happening, you are running the risk of becoming the victim yourself. Okay, so it's kind of a risky thing. So we think of the defenders as kids who are willing to take that risk. So in order to take a social risk, they probably need to be those well-liked, popular kids that have support from others and things like that. Okay? Stereotypically, well-liked, popular, great social skills. Victims, on the other hand, stereotypically are the less popular, less well-liked, the kids with those kinds of characteristics. So when you think of a defender and you think of a victim, you kind of think of two different people. But with this correlation of 0.41, that made me think, oh, there's probably a lot of overlap there. There's probably some kids who not only defend others, but they also are victims. And so I found that group to be particularly interesting. Like, why would they do that? Why would they take that risk of being a defender when they're already a target or a victim? So I was like, we need to figure more out about that. So this semester, I have a couple undergrad students who are working with me for undergrad research. And I convinced them that this is a great topic. And so we have been working on this for a while. So they've been helping with like the lit search and things like that. And I was running analyses and I was like, oh my gosh, this turned out exactly how I thought it was going to. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. So the data that I collected for this study came from middle school students. Okay, I have data for elementary school students as well. I just haven't had the time to be able to run the analyses with the elementary. So this is middle school students. So I had 350 middle school students and I created groups with them. So the kids that had the top 25% of the victim scores, they became my victim group. The kids who had the top 25% of defender scores, they became my defender group. And if kids had high scores in both of those, then that was my victimized defender group, okay? And I was actually really surprised that I had so many kids to be both. There ended up being 95 victim defenders, which seemed like a ton to me, and I like triple checked it. I I know that's correct. There were 72 just defenders, and there ended up only being 19 that were just victims. Okay, so the victims, remember, they had scores in the top 25%. So there's 350 kids, they all had a victim score that ranged, there's a range of those. So the victims were only the kids that were in the top 25% of the scores in their school. So the victimized defenders had the top 25% of victims as well as the top 25% of their defense score. So there was a lot of kids that had high scores in both of those areas. So I was pretty surprised whenever it worked out like that. Of these kids, so all 350 kids, they all filled out a ton of information about themselves, and their teachers also completed information about them, okay? This is coming from their room. For some reason, these speakers are like hooked to their computer, so just ignore. So they filled out a ton of surveys, a ton. The one that measured the roles is called the Bully Participant Behavior Survey, and so that measures bully, assistant, victim, defender, and outsider. So we just use the victim and the defender scores for this. And I also asked them questions about social skills, their behaviors and emotional characteristics, social support that they feel from their peers, and social support they feel from their teachers, and then as well as executive functioning, but I just looked at inhibition and emotional regulation. Oh, we also used their grade point average that they just, we pulled from their school records. Okay, so this table is the summary. However, it's a little overwhelming at first, but there's really not a great way to summarize this stuff without using a table. And so I'll explain a little bit what that looks like. So these are the categories of the information we collected: social support, social skills, emotional, school, and social cognitive. Those are the categories of information that we collected. At the top of the table here, so this means defenders had better scores than both victimized defenders and victims. Okay, so statistically, the defenders had higher scores or better scores than the victims and the defenders, or victimized defenders and victims. Here, the defenders and the victimized defenders, they had significantly higher scores than the victim. Okay, and then on this one, there were significant differences between all three of those groups. Okay, so defenders had the highest scores, and then victimized defenders, and then victims. Does that make sense? Okay, so all of these different things, there were differences between these different groups, okay? So the first one, under yellow, was their emotional characteristics or emotional difficulties. So we had personal adjustment, and defenders had much higher scores in personal adjustment. They had lower scores in attention hyperactivity, lower internalizing problems, and higher resiliency, okay? So internalizing problems are things like symptoms of anxiety and depression. So this really makes sense with what the research was already telling us, that defenders had better outcomes on those emotional characteristics than the kids who were victimized. Okay, so in this case, the defenders had higher scores than both victims and the victimized defenders. Okay? Social cognitive. So inhibition, that's like, are they able to kind of control or inhibit their actions? Okay? Kids with ADHD have a huge problem with this. They don't have a lot of inhibitory control. Okay, so it is something related to social behaviors. It's typically thought of more with kids with ADHD, but it can be applied in other social situations. And also emotional regulation, the ability to regulate emotions. Those two things go together really well. When you think about emotional regulation, that means that if they're super angry, you may not be able to tell, or they can control it so they're not having an outburst, but so it's like a controlled, they can, kind of keep it together. As a defender, emotional regulation is really important because say you were a defender and you saw some really unfair bullying happening, and if you just get really mad and run up there and you're like, what are you doing? That's not very helpful to the victim. That's not going to be helpful for them. But if you can go up there and kind of calmly say something, or if you can calmly go report to a teacher, or you can, comfort the victim afterwards, that's going to be a very beneficial thing that allows you to be a defender than if you did not have the ability to regulate. Because guess what? If you go crazy and go running in there and try to stop bullying, you're probably going to get it next. You're going to be next on their list. So emotional regulation is a very important thing. Social support. So this is where we saw like a stair step. Defenders had the highest social support, and then victimized defenders had the second highest social support, and then victims had the lowest levels of social support. And that was what I would expect based on the research. Defenders probably do perceive more support than others, and victims tend to report low levels of support. So it's not surprising that those victimized defenders have like moderate or middle level of support. So that wasn't too surprising to me. So looking at social skills, I used 5 different social skills: assertion, cooperation, responsibility, self-control, and empathy. And so this was something that I thought was really interesting with the results, is that for these 4 social skills, the victimized defenders looked a lot more like the victims. Okay? They had significant differences still, but they still were lower. Okay, so the victimized defenders had lower social skills than defenders, but higher social skills than victims. However, for empathy, it's kind of the unique characteristics of defenders, is that defenders and the victimized defenders both had really high levels of empathy. And really, I think empathy is probably one of the key things that makes somebody a defender or not. Which kind of makes a lot of sense, just logically, whether you know how to find a research article or not. Like, that just makes a lot of sense, that you have to feel badly for somebody before you're going to want to help them, right? If you don't feel bad for somebody, it's probably not all that likely that you're going to put yourself out there and take a risk to defend them. And so empathy is a really key characteristic when we're trying to decide who's more likely to be a defender or not. Okay, so empathy is really important. School problems. So questions related to school problems were things like, I like school, or my teachers like me, or I hate school, or I like to skip out on classes, things like that. So basically they just don't like school. But also I combined GPA on that row as well, because a lot of times kids who like school tend to be better at school. If you're not very good at school, they tend not to like school as well. But for both of those, the questions about school problems and GPA, the defenders, again, had the highest score, and then it was the victimized defenders, and then it was the victims. Okay, so again, I would probably predict that based on what we know about victims and defenders separately. Okay, so whenever you put all of that stuff in the table under here, so victims, here's what they looked like. Victimized defenders, here's what they looked like. Defenders, that's what they looked like, okay? When you put them all together, this is what it looks like, which is still pretty confusing. There's still a lot of information in there, but you can kind of summarize it here. Victimized defenders are unique. They have high emotional problems, moderate social support and social skills, and high empathy. So in 50 minutes, I could have said just this, and I could have said, bye, have fun, go to the next thing. But of course, I had to drag it out because I'm a professor, so I have to talk a lot. But this is kind of the summary, okay? So victimized defenders are unique because they have high emotional problems. So in that way, they look a lot like victims. They have moderate social support and social skills, but they also have really high empathy, okay? So that high empathy is something that's really important when we're looking at defending behaviors. Okay, so victimized defenders and victims looked a lot alike here. Okay, they were different with social support and social skills because they had those moderate levels. Defenders had high levels, victimized defenders had moderate, and then victims had the lower levels. And then the high empathy is what made them look more like defenders. So when you put it this way, and you're kind of highlighting what makes them different, the only thing they really had a lot in common with defenders was the empathy. Okay, so empathy for others might be one of the key things that leads kids to want to defend. Now, there's a lot of things. I'm sure we have all been in a situation where we have felt badly for somebody but didn't necessarily do anything about it. Like, we can all probably think of a situation. Like, I was in the food court the other day and somebody dropped their tray of food. I felt really badly, but I didn't do anything about it. I didn't go over or offer to buy their lunch or help them clean up. And I was like, I didn't really think about it. I was like, but they're an adult. They can pick up their own food. I pick up my kids' food all the time. Like, they're 25. They can pick up their own food. But I felt badly, but I didn't really do anything. Okay? What would have been the difference if I would have done something? Maybe they were crying. If they would have dropped their food and like burst out into tears, or if they would have fallen and like they looked hurt, I probably would have been much more likely if they like dropped their food and started laughing like that. Probably I might feel bad for them, but like they looked okay. They're going to handle it pretty well. But there's other things other than just empathy that makes somebody defend or not. Okay, so we don't know what else is required, but we do know empathy is really important. Okay, so these are the things that do make victimized defenders a little different. They have the high empathy, but they have those moderate levels of the support and the social skills. So these three things are what make them not just victims. Okay, so the difference between victims and victimized defenders as far as their social emotional characteristics are these things. Okay, they have moderate support, moderate skills, social skills, and high empathy. Yeah?
So a victimized defender is essentially a defender that was victimized,
yeah.
Correct?
That is a good point, and that's actually one of the things that I was going to say. We don't know if they were defenders first and then victimized, or if they were victimized first and then became a defender. We don't know. If anybody wants to go to grad school and do a dissertation on that, that would be great. I would help you write it because I think that'd be really interesting. So we don't know which one came first. I don't know if I could even make an argument one way or the other at this point, because I could think of situations for both of those things. I could see where somebody maybe was a defender. They like typically wanted to like help people and defend people, but maybe they like were perceived as a tattletale or perceived as like, I don't know, different from other people. So then suddenly they were getting victimized. I don't know. Another situation could be they were victims and they were victimized so much that over time they decided, well, I want to help people who are also getting picked on by their friends. So then suddenly they become a defender and want to help. I don't really know. I think that is a really good question that we should ask in the research, but it hasn't been asked yet because I could not find a single article about victimized defenders or victim defenders, or I used about 15 different combinations of search terms and couldn't find anything. And so it's just not something that has been talked about a lot in the bullying research. And so the question of which came first is like, ooh, I don't know. We don't know yet. So that's a good point. So the summary of the findings, I'm not going to go over this because we're going to run out of time, and I think I've talked about this a lot. But the implications for people who work in the schools, one is you have to know that not all victims are the same. Okay? So not all victims have the same exact experiences or characteristics. So just because you see somebody getting picked on doesn't necessarily mean that it is inherently their fault. Okay? Since some of those victimized defenders, so some of these kids, they do have higher levels of support. They do have better social skills, and they do have high empathy. So it's not that you should like see somebody getting victimized and then instantly think, oh, they're a victim. Because they might have some of those better outcomes like social support and things like that that lead them to have, less stress, or they might be able to cope better if they have those higher levels of support and social skills. Victimized defenders are not necessarily worse off than victims only, because when we first started studying bully victims, they were actually finding that kids who had high levels of bullying and victimization, they were actually worse off typically than kids who were just victims or just bullies. So those kids, that was the worst case scenario for them, because if you're both bullies and victims, that was a bad thing, okay? Because you're going to see the lowest level of social skills, the highest levels of depression and anxiety, the worst school problems, the worst academic problems. But that's not the case. So victimized defenders, actually, that is better for them. So victimized offenders tended to have better levels of a lot of these social emotional characteristics. Though victimized offenders do have higher levels of some skills, they still report high levels of emotional and school problems. Okay, so if you are a teacher or a counselor or a psychologist in a school, then it's still really important to address those emotional needs. Okay, just because they sometimes are defending others doesn't mean that they're completely, fine by themselves, because they are still reporting high levels of internalizing problems like anxiety and depression and things like that. So it still is really important to treat that or address those needs, even if they do have okay social skills or okay support. All right? All victimized students are more likely to have emotional problems, so whether they defend or not, it doesn't matter. You should still address those emotional problems. Am I blinding anybody with? Whoa!
You're just telling me about your experience with Bionic.
I've had
Bionic.
in my room in their freshman mentoring groups, and it's just
I'll
been
let that
really
play.
great to see them. Freshmen come in and they're scared to death of high school, and so they aren't really
Should go,
used
knock
to,
over there.
I mean, they see each other
What are
in
you
middle
doing?
school. They aren't really used to being in groups and seeing upperclassmen in there. So it's been really cool to see some of the upperclassmen I had last year kind of take charge and be the leaders in the group and show the little freshmen around, and kind of cool to see the freshmen throughout the semester and see how, they've adjusted to being in mentoring and that kind of stuff. So I've seen a lot of really, really cool things going on with it, and being in there is really cool to see it too.
In your opinion, how have Mattoon High School students been affected by Bionic?
Well, I think we still have a few students who come in, and I've taught freshmen for many years, that some kids just aren't quite ready. It's a maturation process, and all kids, we have that preconceived things that we look at, whether it's walking into a class or walking into high school, and some kids are definitely just uncomfortable and feel like they're
You can
ready.
fill out your evaluations as you're waiting.
Probably what it's done is help those kids become a little bit more comfortable with their settings, their interactions with other students, especially maybe some of the upperclassmen, and sort of have mended that to make it just a little bit more enjoyable experience for everybody involved.
How have the faculty and staff at Mattoon High School been affected by Bionic?
Well, I think we've all been affected by the positive things, and we maybe don't even recognize it. And especially for those teachers who aren't, a part of the mentoring or don't have freshmen. That's a lot of our staff, actually. A really good thing that happened was that during one of our faculty meetings, we had some of the mentors come and talk about their experiences, and it was cool to watch the other staff members, because I've been a part of things, so I kind of know, but they didn't, and they were just agog, really. After those kids left, they were just like, oh my gosh, I cannot even believe, and just had nothing but positive things to say.
How has the school culture in general been affected by Bionic?
I think it's brought us together.
It's Bionic.
I think you see more collaboration between teacher and student, and then student to student more often. Now, I don't remember seeing that in the past years where there's been, one teacher can tell one student something and then that's it. Now we tell a student something and it seems like that student goes and tells every other student, and I think that kind of picks it up a little bit and kind of brings a nice wholeness to the school. And I have enjoyed this year more, and I don't know if it's because of Bionic or if it's just my 4th year teaching, but in my short little lived career of 4 years, I think it's just improved. I feel more at home at school, and I think it's because the kids have that upperclassmen to kind of look towards.
Can you speak to any maybe personal experiences or personal stories with Bionic?
I think for me, more than anything, being in the room at lunch when the mentors and the freshmen get together and watching their interactions and watching growth over time. Speaking from first semester, I had a lot of students that I knew from class personally on both sides of that, and just watching them at first be unsure of each other and slowly warm up to where at the end, and they were conversating and talking about a lot of different things, school related, not school related, and to see those friendships grow, that said a lot to me. I thought that was really cool.
What is one of the biggest benefits of Bionic?
I think the social interaction, the support system of the older student to the younger student. It's different from your peers. It's somebody that, again, that you can look up to. It's that role model, somebody that you can see in the hallway besides your peers that you can say hi to, somebody that you can go to if you have problems, somebody that you can go to vent. I've seen all those things go. I've seen mentors bring students out of their shyness. I've seen mentors include students who might not normally be included in social interaction. I've seen mentors nicely and in a friendly way put students in their place, which is kind of nice. That's not a teacher that has to do that. And so I think all that, I think is a positive. I would absolutely recommend it. You know, I've heard of mentoring programs in other high schools, but I've never seen one that actually panned out like this one. So yes, I think it's an excellent program.
All right. Oh, hurry up and finish before they do another video. So like I mentioned earlier, future areas for research, which came first, the chicken or the egg, okay? Which came first? Were they victims first and then they started defending, or were they defenders first, then they started being victimized, or did they naturally kind of, both of those happen at the same time? We don't know. Longitudinal changes, so over time, we don't know if their status as a victim or as a defender or as a victimized defender, if that changes over time. Okay, that might be a developmental change that we see in kids. We don't know. Maybe they start out as a defender and over time
feel like they belong.
and then over time they
changed.
changed.
Overall thing that, we want you here.
It's like 2 videos.
This is,
whenever there.
we're glad you're here. I think that's probably the overarching goal of the program for me. It's not really about attendance. It's not really, although those things are nice. But if kids feel like they belong, then all those things are going to fall into place.
So I was at a conference and a woman introduced the Bionic program. And Bionic stands for Believe It or Not, I Care, which was a mentoring program originating in a high school. And I was inspired and excited about what that might be like at Mattoon High School. I think that young people today need mentors that help them navigate an important transition like high school. The freshman mentoring program involves juniors and seniors who are called mentors, and each of them are paired with 4 or 5 freshmen. And their responsibilities include having lunch with them, meeting with them and doing a little bit of curriculum, and basically taking them under their wing and kind of helping them navigate Mattoon High School.
I think it's really cool because not only am I making 4 to 5 new friends, but they are also making 4 to 5 new friends.
You build a relationship every day when you come in. It's the little things. It's not one big defining moment. It's all the little things you do. It's the way you treat them. It's the way you talk to them. It's the way you listen.
They share experiences, kind of ask questions, and also hopefully help influence in a positive way those freshmen.
All right, sorry about that. It's not a not so subliminal message about Bionic.
The second team is called the Greek team.
We'll go ahead and call it quits there.